I want you to picture a state that once stretched across 3 continents, that ruled for more than 600 years, that controlled the routes between Europe and Asia, and held 2 of the holiest cities in Islam under its protection. And then I want you to picture that same state in the space of a single lifetime, reduced to a handful of negotiators sitting in a room in Switzerland, signing away everything that was left. How does something that big just come apart? That's the question I want to sit with today, because the answer isn't really about armies. It's about people, a handful of them, at a handful of moments, who each made a choice that the rest of history had to live with. To understand how this all started, you have to go back to the very end of the 1200s, to a strip of land in northwestern Anatolia that almost nobody outside the region could have found on a map. This was a rough neighborhood. A few decades earlier, Mongol armies sweeping out of Central Asia had shattered the old centers of Islamic power. Baghdad had been sacked. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had held symbolic authority over the Muslim world for 500 years, was gone. Refugees and displaced Turkic tribes were pouring west, looking for anywhere they could put down roots. One of those tribal leaders was a man named Osman, head of a small band of Turkmen following the old Seljuk frontier tradition of the Ghazi, a warrior fighting on the edge of the Islamic world, right up against Byzantine territory. Most historians date the founding of what would become the Ottoman state to around 1299, when Osman effectively broke away from the crumbling Seljuk authority and began ruling in his own name from a small town called Sogat. He had no navy, no treasury worth mentioning, and no city of any size. What he had was position, a foothold on the Byzantine frontier, and a talent for making alliances stick. Here's what made Osman's little principality different from the dozen or so other Turkish beyliks scattered across Anatolia at the time. He almost never fought other Muslims. He picked one direction, west toward Byzantium, and stayed focused on it for decades. That single-mindedness pulled in warriors, and eventually it pulled in something more valuable: cooperation from local Byzantine governors and Greek villages who decided that living under this new frontier lord, with its lighter taxes and functioning order, beat living through the chaos of a dying empire. Osman never lived to see his greatest prize. He died around 1326, just as his son Orhan was finally forcing the surrender of the wealthy Byzantine city of Bursa after a long siege. Bursa became the first real Ottoman capital, stone buildings replacing tents, the first Ottoman coins minted, a formal army starting to take shape instead of seasonal raiding parties. Up to that point, the fighting force had mostly been volunteers who returned to farming or herding once a campaign ended. Orhan began building something closer to a standing army, soldiers who were paid a regular wage and stayed under arms year-round, which meant the state could now move faster and hold territory longer than any of the rival Turkish principalities around it that were still relying on seasonal levies. Orhan's forces also conquered Nicaea, once the site of one of early Christianity's most important church councils, folding another major Byzantine center into Ottoman hands and pushing the frontier even closer to Constantinople itself. From there, the expansion didn't slow down. Orhan's forces crossed into Europe for the first time in the 1350s, first as invited allies in a Byzantine civil war, and once they'd tasted the ground on the other side of the straits, as permanent settlers who had no intention of leaving. An earthquake leveled the walls around Gallipoli in 1354, and Ottoman forces simply moved in and stayed. Within a generation, the center of Ottoman power itself shifted out of Asia entirely. Sultan Murad I moved the capital to Edirne, deep in the Balkans, putting the Ottomans within striking distance of practically every kingdom in southeastern Europe. Serbian and Bulgarian forces tried to unite against this rising power, and were crushed at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, a battle so pivotal that Murad himself died on that field, reportedly assassinated after the fighting had ended, making him the only Ottoman sultan ever killed in combat. But here's the moment I actually want to slow down on, because it's the one almost nobody expects. Murad's son inherited the throne and moved so fast through his campaigns that people started calling him Yildirim, the Thunderbolt. He crushed a massive European crusading army at Nicopolis in 1196. He put Constantinople itself under a years-long blockade. By every measure, the Ottoman state under Bayezid looked less like a frontier principality and more like the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean. And then it nearly ended completely. Far to the east, a conqueror named Timur, known in Europe as Tamerlane, had built an empire stretching from Central Asia through Persia, and Bayezid began exchanging increasingly hostile letters over rival Anatolian rulers who'd fled to Timur's protection after Bayezid absorbed their territories. Diplomacy down. In July of 1402, the two armies met near Ankara. Bayezid's forces are estimated to have numbered somewhere around 85,000. Timur's were larger, and by several accounts included war elephants that the Ottoman troops had never faced before. Exhausted after a brutal march through summer heat with limited water, and abandoned mid-battle by Anatolian auxiliary troops who switched sides, the Ottoman army collapsed. Bayezid fought until his own horse went down. He was captured, the only Ottoman sultan in the empire's entire history to be taken prisoner by an enemy. What happened to him next has become one of the most retold and most distorted stories in Ottoman history, so let me be careful here. Later European writers, centuries later, in plays like Christopher Marlowe's Tamburlaine, claimed Timur locked Bayezid in an iron cage and paraded him around like an animal. Modern historians treat that version with real skepticism. It appears to be dramatic embellishment layered on long after the fact. What does seem to be true, from contemporaries closer to events, is more human and honestly sadder. Bayezid was held in captivity, reportedly treated with a strange mixture of respect and humiliation. And he died within about 8 months, in early 1403, never freed. He never saw his empire again. And for a moment it looked like that empire might not survive him. This is where you have to picture the panic, because there was no clear heir in control. Bayezid's surviving sons scattered to different power bases and started fighting each other for the throne, a period historians call the Ottoman Interregnum, and it dragged on for roughly 11 years. Anatolian principalities that had been absorbed by force declared independence again. The Balkans slid into uncertainty. If you'd asked an educated observer in Europe in 1405 whether the Ottoman state would still exist in 50 years, plenty of people would have said no. Empires that lose their ruler and collapse into civil war usually don't come back. This one did, slowly clawed back together by one of Bayezid's sons, Mehmed I, and historians still refer to him as something close to a second founder of the state. It's worth sitting with that near-death experience for a second, because it tells you something the triumphant version of this story usually skips over. The Ottoman rise wasn't one long, unbroken climb. It nearly ended in a single afternoon outside Ankara, and it survived mostly through the stubbornness of individual people who refused to let it die. Half a century later, another individual choice would define the empire for the next several centuries. And this is where the human cost of all this becomes impossible to ignore. By 1451, a 21-year-old sultan named Mehmed II had one obsession: capturing Constantinople, the ancient Byzantine capital that had survived every siege thrown at it for over 1,000 years. He prepared for years rather than rushing, building a fortress on the Bosphorus to choke off supply routes, commissioning what were, for their time, the largest cannons ever cast, built by a Hungarian founder named Orban who'd previously tried and failed to sell his services to the Byzantines first. When the siege finally began in April 1453, the numbers were brutally lopsided. Historians estimate Mehmed's forces at somewhere between 60 and 80,000 men. The city's defenders numbered only around 7 to 8,000, many of them Genoese and Venetian volunteers who had no obligation to be there at all beyond conviction. Their commander was a Genoese soldier named Giovanni Giustiniani, who had arrived with a company of his own men to help defend a city that wasn't even his. For weeks he held the walls, personally directing repairs each night to breaches the Ottoman cannons had blown open during the day. On May 29th, during the final assault, Giustiniani was severely wounded and had to be carried from the walls. and his departure is widely credited by historians with breaking the defender's morale at the critical moment the line gave way. He died shortly after. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine I, made a very different choice. According to the accounts closest to the event, he refused every suggestion that he flee, took off his imperial regalia so he wouldn't be recognized and captured for ransom, and went to fight in the breach alongside his remaining soldiers. His body was never positively identified. With his death, an unbroken imperial line stretching back more than 1,000 years simply ended, on a single morning, on a city wall. Mehmed entered the city that same day. He's recorded as having stopped his troops' initial rampage, ridden to the Hagia Sophia, and ordered it converted into a mosque. A decision that was as much a political declaration as a religious one. He spent years afterward deliberately repopulating a city that had been hollowed out by decades of decline, inviting Muslims, Greeks, Armenians, and Jews to resettle and rebuild it under his rule. From that point forward, the Ottoman state stopped being a regional power and became something closer to a civilization-scale empire, and historians still point to 1453 as one of the conventional dividing lines between the medieval and early modern world. But what nobody expected was that the empire's most dramatic expansion still hadn't happened yet, and it came from an entirely different direction. Two sultans after Mehmed, a ruler named Selim, remembered in Ottoman history as Selim the Grim, turned south instead of west. In a single, brutal year-long campaign in 1516 and 1517, he crushed the Mamluk Sultanate, which had ruled Egypt and the Levant for over 2 centuries, defeating them first near Aleppo and then outside Cairo itself. In roughly 12 months, Selim doubled the size of the empire he'd inherited, absorbing Syria, Palestine, and Egypt in one sweep, and with them, guardianship over Mecca and Medina, the 2 holiest sites in Islam. There's a popular tradition, repeated in a lot of documentaries, that the last Abbasid caliph in Cairo formally handed over the title of caliph to Selim on the spot, transferring centuries of religious authority in a single ceremony. Most modern historians now treat that story with real doubt. It doesn't appear in sources close to the events themselves, and seems to have emerged as a retelling roughly 2 centuries later. What's not in doubt is that Selim's conquest made the Ottoman Sultan, in practice if not through any formal handover, the most powerful ruler in the Sunni Muslim world, a status the dynasty held for the next 400 years. But the human cost of this expansion didn't stop with one siege. 73 years later, another young monarch would learn that lesson the hard way. In the summer of 1526, Sultan Suleiman, later known as Suleiman the Magnificent, marched roughly 100,000 troops into Hungary. King Louis II, just 20 years old, gathered what forces he could, somewhere around 25,000 men, and rode out to meet him near the town of Mohacs, rather than wait for reinforcements that never arrived in time. The battle lasted barely 2 hours. Ottoman artillery and disciplined Janissary musket fire tore through the Hungarian center, and Ottoman cavalry closed around the flanks. Nearly the entire Hungarian royal army was destroyed. Louis himself drowned trying to flee across a stream, weighed down, according to most accounts, by his own armor. He was 20 years old, and with no legitimate heir, his death effectively ended Hungary as a unified independent kingdom for generations. What strikes me about all 3 of these moments, Bayezid dying a prisoner, Constantine dying anonymously in a breach, Louis drowning in a stream at 20, is that the sweeping story of an empire or falling is really just this, over and over. Individual people making a last stand or a last decision, and the map getting redrawn around whatever they chose. After Mohacs, the escalation only accelerated. Suleiman pushed Ottoman power to its absolute peak, and he'd actually started that streak earlier in 1522, by finally taking Rhodes from the Knights of St. John, a heavily fortified island stronghold that had resisted every previous Ottoman attempt, including one led by Mehmed the Conqueror himself decades earlier. After months of siege, Suleiman offered the surviving knights safe passage off the island rather than slaughtering them, a decision that earned him a measure of respect, even among his enemies in Europe. From there he moved on Belgrade, absorbed most of Hungary after Mohacs, and in 1529 brought an army all the way to the gates of Vienna itself, the first time the Ottomans had reached that deep into Central Europe. Heavy rain and an overstretched supply line forced a withdrawal before the city fell, but the message had landed across the continent regardless. This empire could reach anywhere it wanted to. At sea under the Admiral Barbarossa, a former corsair who Suleiman had personally recruited into Ottoman service and made Grand Admiral of the fleet, the Ottoman navy crushed a combined European fleet at the Battle of Preveza in 1538, and effectively ruled the Mediterranean for the next 3 decades. Suleiman ruled for 46 years, reorganized the empire's legal and tax systems so thoroughly that Ottoman sources call him Kanuni, the lawgiver, by the time he died in 1566. During yet another campaign, the empire stretched from Algiers to the Persian Gulf, from Crimea to Yemen. But here's the turn nobody watching in 1566 could have predicted. The empire's momentum had already started to crack quietly in exactly the years everyone assumed it was invincible. In 1571, a coalition of European naval powers, the Holy League, destroyed most of the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Lepanto, one of the largest naval battles in Mediterranean history up to that point. It's said that the Ottoman Grand Vizier at the time dismissed the loss to a Venetian ambassador with a line about how taking Cyprus had cut off an arm, while losing at Lepanto had only shaved a beard that grows back thicker. Whether he actually said those exact words is disputed, but the underlying point held for a while. The Ottomans rebuilt their fleet within about a year. Still, Lepanto is generally regarded by historians as the first real proof that this empire could be beaten. And then, in 1683, came the moment that actually did mark the turning point everyone had been waiting for. A massive Ottoman army under Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa laid siege to Vienna for 2 months. Relief forces gathered from across the Holy Roman Empire and Poland, led by the Polish King John III Sobieski, and on the 12th of September they launched a devastating cavalry down from the hills above the city, one of the largest cavalry charges in European history, that shattered the Ottoman lines within hours. Kara Mustafa fled the field and was later executed on the Sultan's orders for the failure. After 1683, the Ottoman Empire was no longer the side pushing forward into Europe. It was the side being pushed back, and within 16 years, the Treaty of Karlowitz forced the empire to formally cede huge territories, including most of Hungary, the first time in its history it had officially accepted losing that much ground at once. What followed wasn't a straight collapse. It never is. There were real reform efforts, genuine attempts to modernize entire periods, like the so-called Tulip era of the early 1700s, where the empire tried studying Europe's military academies and printing presses, rather than just fighting them. The first Ottoman printing press to publish books in Turkish opened in 1727, decades after Jewish, Armenian, and Greek communities inside Ottoman territory had already been printing in their own languages for years. Later, in the early 1800s, Sultan Mehmed II went much further, abolishing the Janissary Corps outright in 1826 after they degenerated from professional soldiers into a politically entrenched faction that resisted every attempt at military reform. An event so violent and so consequential that Ottoman histories still refer to it by a name meaning the auspicious incident. But underneath all of these reform efforts sat a structural problem that never really went away. European states were industrializing, building permanent professional armies backed by factories and railways, while the Ottoman state kept trying to modern institutions onto a much older system, one reform generation at a time, while continuing to lose territory in nearly every war it fought through the 1700s and 1800s. Greece won independence in the 1820s, after an 1827 naval battle at Navarino. Much of the remaining Ottoman fleet, the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 and 1878 pushed Russia's forces to within sight of Istanbul itself before European powers intervened diplomatically to keep Russia from claiming everything. By the early 1900s, the Balkan Wars of 1912, most of what remained of Ottoman territory in Europe within a matter of months. sending hundreds of thousands of displaced Muslim refugees fleeing into Anatolia, many of whom never made it that far at all. And then came the First World War, which is really where this story finds its resolution, and its most staggering human cost of all. The Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary in late 1914, largely out of fear that Britain, France, and Russia intended to dismantle it regardless of what it did. In 1915, Britain and France attempted to force open the Dardanelles and knock the empire out of the war in one stroke, landing troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula that April. The Ottoman defense was organized in large part by a young officer named Mustafa Kemal, who would later be known as Ataturk. Facing an Anzac landing that threatened to overrun his position, he's recorded as having given his 19th Division an order that has been quoted in Turkish and Australian histories ever since. He told them he wasn't ordering them to fight. He was ordering them to die, so that other troops would have time to arrive and take their place. The campaign dragged on for 8 brutal months. By the time the Allies withdrew in January 1916, the fighting had produced somewhere in the range of 500,000 total casualties on both sides combined. Over 56,000 Ottoman dead alone, and a roughly equal number of Allied dead. Gallipoli was, by any measure, a genuine Ottoman victory. It just wasn't enough to save the empire it was fighting for, because everywhere else, the war went badly. British forces took Jerusalem in 1917 and Damascus in 1918. The empire's Arab allies had turned against it in a revolt in the Hejaz. And this part often gets flattened out of the story. Hundreds of thousands of Arab soldiers continued fighting inside Ottoman ranks throughout the war, which makes it inaccurate to describe the conflict simply as Turks against Arabs. By October 1918, with its European allies collapsing and its supply lines cut, the empire signed an armistice. Weeks later, Allied warships sailed into Istanbul and occupied the capital outright. The first time in centuries a foreign power controlled the city. That should have been the end of the story, but it wasn't quite. A resistance movement formed in Anatolia, led once again by Mustafa Kemal, and by 1922 his forces had pushed the occupying armies out and effectively ended the war on Turkish terms. And this is where the empire's actual final resolution happened, not on a battlefield, but in a parliamentary vote. On the 1st of November 1922, the Grand National Assembly formally abolished the Ottoman Sultanate. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, boarded a British warship and left the country he could no longer govern on the 17th of that same month. The Republic of Turkey was proclaimed the following October. And in one final act, on the 3rd of March 1924, the Grand National Assembly abolished the Ottoman Caliphate as well, ending the last formal institution. 625 years, give or take, after Osman first declared his independence in a small town most of Europe had never heard of. Zoom out from all of that, and you start to see how much of the modern map and the modern world was quietly shaped by this one dynasty's rise and fall. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, some Byzantine scholars fled west into Italy carrying Greek manuscripts with them. Manuscripts that scholars generally agree fed directly into the intellectual current of the European Renaissance. European kingdoms, increasingly locked out of overland trade routes that Ottoman territory now controlled, poured resources into finding sea routes to Asia instead. The same search for alternatives that helped drive the voyages of Columbus and da Gama a generation later. Borders drawn or redrawn because of Ottoman conquest and Ottoman retreat still define the shape of more than 36 countries today, from the Balkans through the Middle East and North Africa. Cities the empire built, rebuilt, or reshaped, Istanbul most of all, still carry its architecture, its legal traditions, its cuisine, its music, layered under everything that came after. You can even trace the empire's fingerprints into institutions most people never connect to it at all. The Devshirme system, under which boys from Christian families in the Balkans were taken into Ottoman service, educated, and trained, some rising all the way to Grand Vizier, meant that for centuries, a person's birth mattered less to their career inside the Ottoman state. than it did almost anywhere else in Europe at the time. The Hejaz Railway, built in the early 20th century partly through donations from Muslims around the world, was engineered to make the pilgrimage to Mecca faster and safer, and pieces of that same railway line are still visible in the desert today. Even the modern nation-state boundaries that dominate headlines out of the Middle East trace directly back to how this empire's territory was carved up in the years right after the First World War. None of that is ancient history in the way it can feel from a distance. It's closer to the present than most of us assume. So here's what actually gets me about this story, 600 down into an hour of research. An empire that outlasted the Byzantine Empire, that survived a near-total collapse and ended it at Suleiman II, that reached the absolute peak of its power in only a century and a half before the wheels started quietly come Vienna. That entire arc still came down to a handful of people making choices at the worst possible moments. A captured sultan who never got home, an emperor who wouldn't run, a 21-year-old drowned in his own armor, who ordered his men to buy time with their lives. Empires don't really fall in some abstract, inevitable way. They fall because at some specific hour, on some specific day, a specific person's decision didn't hold. I'd love to know what you think actually decided it in the end. Was it Ankara in 1402, Vienna in 1683, or something that happened much later than most people assume? Tell me in the comments, and if you want more of these deep dives into the moments that quietly rewired the world, go ahead and subscribe. There's a lot more history where this came from.